Welcome to today's episode. We have a very exciting guest, Richard Rabins, CEO and co-founder of Alpha Software. And for anyone who's just tuning in for the first time today to our podcast, we are Stravix, a company that helps financial firms scale revenue and operate more efficiently. So if you want to learn how to take your business to the next level, make sure to stick around. And if you're interested in our free growth consultation, drop the word growth in the DMs or comments below and we'll get back to you. So Richard, we are super excited to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today, Megan.
So Richard, why don't you walk us through a little bit about your personal and professional journey, just the early days?
Okay, you might detect I'm not exactly a native Bostonian, although I've lived in Boston, Greater Boston, for many years. I grew up in a country that doesn't exist anymore. It used to be called Rhodesia. It's now called Zimbabwe. And then the family moved to South Africa. So I grew up until early 20s in South Africa. I have a couple of engineering degrees. I ended up going to the business school at MIT, which was a great way to, enter a new country, so to speak, and make friends and, get integrated. And, I worked for a number of years for a very interesting company that had been founded by MIT professors. It was a marketing company, but it had a very specific, essentially, they had developed a technique for mainly consumer product companies, although not exclusively, that allowed them to do simulated test markets. So if P&G was bringing out a new toothpaste, rather than going to test market, which would be very expensive, they could create a quote-unquote simulated test market, which would be a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and also prevent your competition from seeing what you were up to. So I worked there for a few years, but, I come from an entrepreneurial family. Two of my uncles, they had a great story. They had both been taken prisoner of war in World War II, and I guess decided after that they wanted to do something with their lives. So they started a manufacturing company in South Africa in the late 40s. So I grew up and then my father got involved, etc. So I grew up in a kind of an entrepreneurially oriented family and always wanted to do something entrepreneurial. So after working for this MIT marketing company, I decided to go off and start a company in the software business.
Wow, that's an amazing story, Richard. From then on, what was the next step from then?
So this is going back in like the early 90s. There was obviously lots of opportunity then as there is now. And my brother joined me soon afterwards, and it turns out he has a passion for databases and analytics and stuff. He has a similar engineering MIT background. And so there was a dominant application building product in the early 90s called DBase. And this was just before Windows, so going back to the days of DOS, which some of your listeners may recall, some may not. So DBase was the dominant tool for building custom applications. They actually were a Southern California-based company. And frankly, they should have been the Oracle of today. They had, market dominance and, they were doing really well. But, management got a little too much hubris and they blew it. But DBase was the dominant way you built applications in the 90s, but it was a programming language. And we felt back then, as today, there's a lot of folks who know exactly what they want to build because they're operating businesses, they own businesses, they know what they need in terms of a custom application and, they would prefer not to have to program. So we created a product back then called Alpha 4, which was a menu-driven alternative to DBase. We made it file compatible so you could run it in the same network. And the trick was most of the software back then was sold in retail stores. We were selling in retail and got frustrated because you didn't have a lot of control over the way your software was merchandised and presented. So we started experimenting with direct mail. So not direct email, but actual direct mail. And our message was really simple. It said, if you're struggling with DBase, check us out. That's what our mission is. We've tried to make it much easier to build custom applications. And that message resonated with people. So we grew the company from, $2 million to $25 million in about 2.5 years using direct mail. Because we could speak directly to people and we used sort of just plain English, just talking to people as business people, understanding that they were intrigued by technology, but they were more interested in the results and more interested in having more control. So that was the original company, Alpha Software. Then, as we all know, the world transitioned from DOS, which was the operating system, back then to Windows. Windows 95 was really when Windows took off. And Microsoft came out with and we knew this was going to happen, with a competing product called Access. And we didn't want to compete directly with Microsoft. We thought that wasn't a brilliant idea. So we sold the company to a small Canadian public company. Long story short, I ended up becoming CEO of the public company that had bought us, and then ran that for a number of years. It was trading on NASDAQ and the Toronto Stock Exchange. And then, fast forward to probably about 15 years ago, the dominant operating system, in effect, had become the web. And, we looked around and we saw that similar conditions prevailed, that, to build custom data-driven or database-oriented web applications was difficult. You had to program in some programming language, and even if you knew how to do it, it would take a long time. So we ended up creating a product called Alpha 5, which, similar concept. It was menu-driven. By now, the term had become low-code. So it was a low-code product that allowed you to build apps much more rapidly. And initially, it was for building web apps. Then mobile came along with the iPhone, and you didn't need it to be a genius to figure out that the iPhone was going to impact all kinds of aspects of life, including business. And so we worked really hard to add mobility into the product, i.e. the ability to build mobile apps. And it turns out mobile is actually lots of challenges. One is you don't have a lot of screen real estate. If you want to take a big complex form and squash it onto a screen, you can't just do it literally. You've got to rethink it. Yeah. And then the other major problem is if you've got workers in the field, using mobile apps, you're not guaranteed to have good signal. There's plenty of good signal, but there's still, pretty amazing 2025. There's a lot of situations where the signal is not good. You could be in a tunnel, you could be in a hospital, you could be in an elevator, or you just could be in parts of the country where there's not enough people to justify good cell service. So we worked really hard to make sure that the software could work perfectly when there was no signal. Yeah. And we ended up getting a bunch of patents on that. And so the product then was renamed Alpha Anyway to reflect the mobile capability. And the final part of the story, which takes us up to today, is once we added the mobile capability, we found that a huge percentage of people who wanted to build mobile business applications were actually coming to us saying, look, we've got this data, we've got this paper form for collecting data in the field, whether it was inspection data or safety data or quality control data or any kind of data. And we want to and we use paper to collect all this information. And we want to, digitize and get away from paper. And we want to build a mobile app. And we could do this with Alpha Anyway. But since it was such a common request that kept coming up again and again, we went back and said, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually build a new product using Alpha Anyway as the technology platform, allow one to build these applications extremely rapidly. So, which takes us to this relatively new product called Alpha Transform. And what it does is it lets you take paper forms of any complexity and turn them into sophisticated mobile apps for collecting data, and then built-in workflow for, managing the work that needs to take place once the data is collected, and then also for dashboards and stuff for analyzing data. And to be able to do this, when I say really quickly, we're talking, typically an hour for a page. So if it's a complex 5-page form, we can do it probably in about 5 hours. And we're seeing a lot of success because, we're solving a real problem. Easy to explain what the product does. We do have competitors, which it always amuses me when you ask people who their competitors are. They say they don't have competitors. My response is, if you don't have competitors, maybe you don't have a market, because in an efficient world, if there's a real market, there will be competitors, especially now in a global world. The competitors may not be US-based. The competitors could be anywhere in the world. So there are other mobile forms products out there, but the Alpha Transform, which is the name of the product, we built and aimed it as a real high end for taking very complex forms and dealing with the offline problem and a bunch of other challenges that come with mobile, which is essentially one-handed operation. If you think about it, when you're at a computer, you've got both hands available to type. When you're on a mobile device in the field, you definitely have one hand holding the device and you've only got one finger. And we have customers who, all over in all different industries, but, the one that I think is interesting is people who go up and down ropes doing stuff on buildings. They definitely they've only got one hand to operate with. So that's that's what we're doing today. Essentially, Alpha Transform is the roles of the mobile forms category. And, right now we've done a lot of work in manufacturing, in quality control, but the use cases are across multiple industries. In construction, there's a lot of checklists and punch lists and safety. Same thing in mining and energy. I mean, it's just, you wouldn't have thought in 2025 that there'd still be a lot of paper forms, but it turns out there are, because it's not a trivial problem to solve.
Yeah. Wow. Richard, that was amazing. Thank you for walking us through your story. That was amazing to hear. So you kind of brought us all the way up to today, which I appreciated. Our audience will love hearing about that was decades and decades. That was amazing, and loving hearing all your, and all, the day and age has changed so much. I mean, look where we are now with everything compared to, like you said, like the 90s or whatever. So it was amazing hearing about that. But I definitely want to hear what your goal would be in the future, since we are now talking about the present. What's a goal for your business, like in the next 8 to 12 months, or even a year or two from now?
So, there's all these fancy goals where people say they want to grow the company and then go public and sell the company and all that stuff. I like what I'm doing. So I'm just interested in growing the company. I'm interested in, being able to add value to customers. And, when you've got growth, you can bring on more people, you can pay them well. And, a growing, healthy company is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And that in of itself, if later on down the road somebody wants to come and buy the company and it's the right thing, fine. But I don't think that's certainly not what I spend time thinking about. I spend time thinking about what markets we can go after, what partnerships we can pursue. So right now, we're growing by using people who are calling out to prospects, telemarketing people, and using LinkedIn and stuff to try and find prospects. And then we have a bunch of salespeople who typically, when we get a meeting, will ask the customer to send us one of their forms, ideally before the meeting, so that when we go into the meeting, we can actually show them a finished mobile app that would replace the forms. And that tends to work really well because they can relate to it. It's their form. But in order to accelerate growth, we've embarked on a partnership program. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of other software categories that just haven't paid a lot of attention to what I would call mobile data capture as a requirement. So most of the ERP systems that are out there are very weak when it comes to mobile data capture. Document management systems need the data to be brought in. Even a lot of the AI ML systems, are fed by data. You need data, and you need to be able to collect the data, and the data needs to be very timely and very trustworthy. You can have the most amazing machine learning algorithms, but if you're feeding it data that's compromised or inaccurate, it's not going to, it's like putting a Ferrari and then putting, low octane gasoline in it. Criminal. So you need really good, trustworthy data to drive a lot of the other systems. So we're aligning with partners now who have document management systems, who have ERPs. There could be ERP implementation companies, or they could be ERP companies themselves, workflow companies, etc. And we're finding that the broad need for collecting data in the field, easily and quickly and accurately, is not a need that's well addressed by a lot of software products. And so we're finding partners who can give us more leverage by adding that value.
Well, that sounds like an incredible journey and goal you guys have. I mean, growing and adding value, always a goal for business, right? And you mentioned that is a specific goal that you have for this year. I always like to ask everyone on the podcast this question. If you had like a magic wand that you could just fix one thing in the business that's holding you back or slowing you down to get to your goal, what would that be?
I think, the single biggest challenge is the product is, and you would expect most CEOs of companies would say this, but the product is quite remarkable. It's an incredibly good product. Just a little side story. Our CTO, who's the designer, he hasn't built it all, but did the conceptual design and has built a lot of it, is a guy called Dan Bricklin. And if you just Google him, you'll see he actually invented the spreadsheet. So, which is pretty wild. So
Wow.
the original spreadsheet, which caused Apple II to take off, ran a product called VisiCalc, which was the first spreadsheet. And then VisiCalc was superseded by Lotus 123 and now obviously Excel. But the concept of the spreadsheet and the first implementation was this product called VisiCalc. The creator of VisiCalc is a guy called Dan Bricklin, and he's actually our CTO, and he's the guy behind the Transform product. So back to your question, the product is excellent. And when we get in front of people who've got the requirement, our success rate is high, very high. So the biggest challenge is getting, qualified prospects at in an efficient, affordable way.
Yeah.
I would say that's the single biggest issue for us that will affect, our growth rate.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, Richard. I want to say thank you for telling us all your journey, and I loved learning about all the Alpha software. And kind of to wrap this up, if you could say a word of wisdom, advice, say someone's trying to break into the industry even, what's something that you would tell them as a send-off?
Well, I mean, I think that, as the industry evolves, new opportunities emerge all the time. So, sometimes when would-be entrepreneurs talk to friends and family and say they want to do something, they get pushback and they say, well, how are you going to compete against this one or that one? I think if you're, a driven entrepreneur, just ignore all that stuff, ignore all that noise, and just go ahead and just do it. Obviously, look for a unmet need, but don't let anybody dissuade you. If it's in your blood and it's something you want to do that affects your ultimate well-being and happiness, just do it.
Yeah. That's amazing advice, Richard. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know our audience members will appreciate it.
My pleasure. Enjoyed talking to you, Megan.
Thank you.